Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you how to create a Christmas card using a variety of techniques with your stamps and dies. One of the tricks I'm going to share is how to do watercoloring with solid stamped images. As always, feel free to use supplies from your stash. However, if you are interested in any of the supplies I've used to create the cards in this video, you can find links to them in the supply list in the description box below. For this card, I'm going to be working with the Tim Holtz Sizzix Vault Seasonal Sketch Die Set, and I'm going to be working with the poinsettia and the holly leaf pieces here. You'd also use any poinsettia dies that you might have, or even the original seasonal sketch dies would work for this. The stamp sets I'm going to be using are Santa Visit and Jolly Holiday. And then I'm also going to be using the coordinating die set that goes with the Jolly Holiday to cut out the Santa and the sentiment that I'm going to be using, but you don't need the die set to do this. You could easily cut these out with some scissors. The mediums I'm going to be working with are Distress inks and an archival ink, and the archival ink I'm using is Rustic Wilderness, but you could also replace that with the Distress ink in Rustic Wilderness as well. So I'm going to be using Rustic Wilderness, Lumberjack Plaid, Lost Shadow, Spun Sugar, Tattered Rose, Black Soot, Fossilized Amber, and the Old Paper, and Vintage Photo. I'm going to be using these colors to do some watercoloring. If you would prefer to use the watercolor pencils, you certainly could. I just decided to switch it up a little bit and do some watercoloring with the actual inks. If you don't have the full-size inks pad, you could use the minis. You could also use re-inkers or any kind of watercolor pencils or watercolors that you might have. I'm also going to be using a couple of watercolor pencils. These are the Zig Clean Color Real Brush, and this is black and light gray. As for the papers I'm going to be using, this is just kind of a matte gold cardstock that is from Sizzix, and then I've got some colored watercolor cardstock that I have custom colored with some distressed spray stains, and this is just Lumberjack Plaid. This one is a combination of Rustic Wilderness and peeled paint, and then this one is Shabby Shutters. And I've shared how to do that in multiple videos before. You're simply taking some watercolor cardstock and spraying it with the spray stains and adding a little bit of water and then drying them with your heat tool. And then you've got custom colored cardstock that has a little bit of a distressed mixed media feel to it that you can use for die cutting and creating your cards. The other papers I'm going to be using are distressed watercolor cardstock. I'm going to be doing the watercoloring on this, and then I also have just a piece of some plain white cardstock that will do for the stamping, for the background, and the sentiment. So the first thing I'm going to do is stamp this ticket stamp from the Santa's Visit stamp set onto that plain white cardstock, and I'm using the Lumberjack Plaid Distress ink. And yes, I'm still working in my stamping tool, but I'm using a stamping block just to make it a little bit easier to do the repeat stamping. Instead of having to move the paper, I just have to line up the image and stamp and go. I'm going to repeat that down the paper here for a total of 7 strips of the stamp. Now, if I had done a little bit better job of lining up the stamps, I probably could have gotten all of them on here, but I went ahead and stamped multiples onto some extra paper here. And then now I'm just going to use my scissors and trim these down into strips. Not really worried about perfect cutting of these in any way. So I'm not going to, worry about using my paper trimmer. And I'm using these longer scissors because that longer blade makes it a little bit easier to cut a straight longer section. And then I'm going to come back with my little fussy cutting scissors and kind of trim off the edges and cut out these little notches here. Now, if you want, you can totally skip this part. And if you wanted to do the stamping direct to the paper, I just kind of like the layered textural effect that it creates when you cut them all out separately. I also know that there is a die for this stamp set that's available from Simon Says Stamp if you're interested in that, and I'll make sure to have that linked up in the description box as well for those of you that might be interested in using that instead of the fussy cutting here that I'm doing. But I'm just going to continue trimming all of these out until I get all of my strips cut out, and then we'll go from there. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, if you don't want to do all the fussy cutting part of this, you could just take the stamp and just stamp it repeatedly across the background and create your own background paper that way. Like I said, this is really just to add kind of a fun element of texture and dimension to the background. Once you've got all your tickets stamped out and cut out, then you're going to take some Vintage Photo Distress ink and just ink the edges of those just to give them a little bit of a aged effect. And if you really want to get crazy, you could fold them along the edges and ink where the creases are there, just to really add to that ticket feel. So I'm just going to continue with that until I've got all of these inked, and then we'll move on. Now we've got all of our tickets inked and ready to go, and now I'm just going to take my background paper that's just some white cardstock. I've cut it down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches because I'm going to layer this onto another piece of paper just to kind of frame it. Right now I'm just going to kind of ink the edges of this paper with a little bit of that Vintage Photo Distress ink. And I'm not super worried that I'm not getting like this great, beautiful blend or anything. I'm just wanting to get some color kind of around the edges and onto the paper before I attach the tickets here. And then from here, what I'm going to do is just kind of flatten these out if they're a little bit bent, and then I'm just going to use some adhesive and adhere these to the background. So I'm going to start off up here at the top with the ticket, and I'm just going to kind of center it. And it is going to overhang just a little bit on the edges, and I'll use my scissors later to trim that off. And then we're going to take the next strip some more adhesive here, and I'm going to offset it and kind of center the ticket with the one above. And don't worry about that overhang, because I'm going to show you what we're going to do with that, or this empty spot here. And we're just going to, so then we're going to repeat that process. And at this point, you can kind of start, if you wanted to center it over again this way or that way, whichever you want to do, but I kind of found it easier to just go back then with another one kind of centered. And I'm just kind of butting them up next to each other there. And as you'll see, as we go down the paper here, these are all going to fit pretty nicely. Pretty perfectly. And the one at the bottom is also going to be centered, so I'm going to go ahead and adhere that one. Get that one centered on here as well. And then from here, I can kind of, if I need to like adjust with spacing a little bit, just because things are, you know, they're not exactly the same, just to make sure I don't have any big, huge gaps that are going to be like really, really obvious. So just kind of go from there. And this one I'm going to offset this way. I'm going to leave a little teeny gap there with that one. Probably should have done that a little bit up here as well. But main thing there is just kind of play around maybe a little bit with those other, so you can kind of space it across the paper here if you need to. Especially with this, with a liquid glue, you've got a little bit of time to kind of play around with things before it's adhered completely. And then we're going to just offset that one a little bit. There we are. Okay. Pull that glue down. And so now we can take our scissors, but let's wipe off that excess glue before we start doing that, so we're not getting that on our scissors. I mean, it'll clean off, but why make ourselves more of a mess than we need to? And then we're just going to trim off that bit of overhang. And then we're going to take these 3 pieces that were the kind of larger ones left over from the cutting, and you're just going to kind of position them to fill in that opening, and then just glue those down. And again, just wipe off any excess glue that might be on there. And then again, and then trim off those little overhanging pieces. And then take your blending brush that's going to have still a little bit of ink on it left over from before, and then just ink the edges of those tickets where you cut them off so that they've got that inked edge there as well. And so here is a look at our finished background. So now I'm going to stamp my focal point image, and I'm going to be using that Santa from the Jolly Holiday stamp set, but you could use any Santa stamp that you like. And you might be thinking, how are you going to watercolor an image that is solid? And well, I'm going to show you a little trick. And to do that, you're going to need a really light ink. The color I'm using here is Lost Shadow, and you want it to be an ink like this. It's really light colored. You could use a super light tan. There's other brands out there too. There are inks that are made to do this with, but I found this one works pretty well. And you don't need a great fully stamped image. You just need enough of the image stamped onto the paper. And again, we're using that watercolor paper because we're going to be coloring. And you just need enough so that you can see the shape. Now, if you're concerned, like, oh, I can't really see around the beard real well, then go ahead and stamp it again if you want. And then what you want to do is just make sure and dry this, or let the ink dry, so you don't smear this into any areas where you might not want it smeared. I mean, that's especially the case with this image because you are going to want to leave some of like the fur on his and trim on his coat and his beard white. So now I'm going to start with my watercoloring, and I've got my water brush here, and I just wanted to share something with you This is an old brush. I'll just even put it under the paper towel, and you can see it has been well loved and it doesn't really have much of a fine point anymore. So I recently got myself a new one, and as you can see here, the tip on this one is much more fine and detailed. I thought that would come in handy as I go to color in this image, especially around his face and the beard area. So if you don't have a water brush, you could also use any kind of a paintbrush that you might have. And so yeah, so I'm going to just start off, and I'm just going to push that ink pad onto my craft mat here, and then I'm going to use that water brush, get a little water flowing, and get that ink picked up onto the tip of the brush, and then I'm going to use that tattered rose to color in my Santa's face here. Really doesn't take much ink on that little spot there. And now we'll just continue kind of moving on. And the nice thing about using this kind of an image is, you know, it kind of shows you where you need to put your color. So you can kind of just use that as a guide of where to put it. Now, if you get a lot of color on here and it kind of starts getting away from you a little bit, you know, wipe that excess ink and water over onto a paper towel, and then just start again. You don't want a lot of water. We're not trying to loosey-goosey color here. So if it's starting to get really wet, you can also always stop and grab your heat tool and color and dry that area as well. And then when you're working around like edges here, I kind of find it helpful to rotate the paper so that the tip of my brush is along the edge, so I have a little more control of where that color is going. And then as you're doing your coloring, if you're struggling kind of where to find like where the lines are with things, feel free to grab that stamp and kind of use it as a guide to help you figure out like, oh, you know, I need to have some color here or there. And then the biggest thing really is just, you know, making sure that you don't have too much water on your brush. So you keep that paper towel handy there, and then just going to take your time as you're going along. And another nice thing is you can kind of use the darker areas on the stamp here as to kind of help guide where you maybe want to make it darker, because that would kind of be a little bit of the shadow area. So like here, I went back and kind of darkened in some of these areas just to make it a little darker and add a little more shadow. And to do that, just make sure that it's dry, and then you can kind of go back and add in more color and darken it as you need to. And I can tell you, it's made a huge difference having this new brush. When I first did this, when I was practicing to make the sample, kind of figure out what I wanted to do for this video, I was using that older brush I showed you earlier, and I didn't realize how much I needed a new brush, because it is much easier with this fine little tip here instead of that thicker brush where I was kind of fighting being able to control it along these edges here and get a nice clean edge. So if your brush looks like the one I showed you, of my old ones, you might want to think about getting a new one yourself. And then just remember, you making sure things are dry if you're going to need to put your hand over a section. So, you know, if you've colored in this area and it's still wet, make sure you dry that before you put your hand in it. And we're kind of moving on to the next section. So now I'm going to move on to the next color here. I'm going to do a little bit of the black soot here and be using this for the belt and the boots. Again, if you've got too much water, kind of make sure and wipe that off onto your paper towel. So I'm going to dry that real quick because that's just getting a little too watery for me. I don't want it bleeding down into the red there. And as I'm painting here, I've kind of realized I probably need to add a little more red through this area here I may need to add a little more red. I'm not totally sure yet here, we'll see. All right, now I'm going to go on to the fossilized amber. I'm just going to use this kind of for the buckle area here. And anytime you're going to go in and add color next to another color, you just want to make sure that that previous color is dry before you start adding color in there, or they definitely are going to start bleeding. But that is the nature of watercolor, is it's going to run and go. I'm going to dry that, and then I'm going to go back over it with a little more color just to darken it up a tiny bit more. All right, now it's going to go on to the green. We're going to use that Rustic Wilderness to color his gloves. And again, just kind of following along the outline, turning the paper so that I can put that edge of my brush up against it there. Kind of use that as a, kind of help me guide my way. And let's try that one just to be on the safe side. Now we're going to take a little bit of that sponge sugar, just a teeny little dab there. Clean up my brush, and then I'm just going to add a little touch of that to his cheeks. There we are. Teeny little bit here to his mouth area. And then from here, it's really just a matter of kind of feeling like if there's any spots maybe that need a little bit more color. So I feel like I'm going to get back in here with some of this lumberjack plaid and just kind of fill in a few spots here and there. But you certainly don't need to do this. All right, so now I am going to take some actual watercolor markers, and you might be like, well, why didn't you color this in with watercolor markers? Well, part of that being is I just love the Distress palette and know that, you know, lumberjack plaid is lumberjack plaid. This is the spray stain. This is the Distress ink. And so I know I'm going to have, my colors are going to coordinate, so I don't have to worry about trying to match reds to, you know, the stamped background that we created. Granted, you can get close, but I just kind of like not having to worry about that. So now I'm just, these have a really fine tip on them. These are the Zig Real Brush markers. And I'm just going to use this to just start adding a little bit of detail to my image. So just very lightly going to go kind of around the edge of my colored image. You could, of course, completely skip this, and you don't have to do it at all if you don't want. And I'm just going to use it to kind of help add some shadow and definition to things. And then here I'm just kind of using some of the stamped image here, like the little highlights and stuff, to kind of help figure out where to maybe add a little bit of extra. Once you're done with that, you can also go back in with like this light gray I've got and just add a little bit more shadow to things. I kind of like definitely adding this in on some of the white areas just to kind of blend out a little bit of that black so it's not quite as harsh. It adds in a little bit of shadow. And then from there, if there's any spots that you feel like you need to go back in and touch up or add a little bit more color to, you certainly can. And then once you have your coloring completed, you can use your die or fussy cut the image and have it ready to go for your card. So off camera, I did my die cutting. So I've got some of the outlines from the holly leaves in that gold. I also did the outline of the poinsettia in the gold. And then I've got 2 layers of the poinsettia with the solid layer die cut out of the lumberjack plaid. Then I've got some of the solid leaves out of the shabby shutters, and then some more of the outlines out of that darker green that was a combination of rustic wilderness and peeled paint spray stains. And then I also stamped my sentiment using the rustic wilderness and die cut that as well. And then to give these just a little bit of dimension, I'm going to take the embossing pad and one of the embossing tools from Sizzix, and I'm just going to roll that over the back of these petals just to give them a little bit of dimension. This is certainly a step you could skip if you like, because it will add a little bit of bulk to the card, but I just like the effect it gives. And just kind of gently with this outline piece here. Then you can push down in the middle there, and you flip it over from the front. And then from there, you can just glue these layers together, and then it gives you just a little bit of dimension when you're creating the flower. And I'm going to do that same thing with the leaves as well. And then from here, it was just really a matter of layering the different die cuts, kind of, and creating a little cluster behind the Santa. And, you know, don't be afraid to trim off some of the die cut if you need to or want to make it fit in there so that it's not hanging over the edge of the card. And then just adhere everything in place and you're finished. So here I have all of the embellishments adhered to the card, and I just use a combination of liquid adhesive and foam adhesive just to give it a little more dimension. Of course, if you don't want this much dimension, you could certainly skip the foam tape and then, you know, don't do the dimensional technique that I shared on the flower and leaves. So a time-saving step for the die cutting is skipping the spray and just die cutting these from solid colored cardstock. So here's an example of the same card, and I just did the flowers and leaves from solid colored cardstock, and then I did the background from the same solid color cardstock. So it just gives you a different look. In some ways, I kind of like this one a little bit better, but yeah, I think it just gives you some options. And then to finish off the card, I wanted to create another layer to matte behind the background piece. And so I'm just going to ink blend some rustic wilderness around the piece of white cardstock here. And you just need to add the ink to the edges because the center part's going to be covered. And then adhere all these layers together and your card is ready. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is just ink the edges with a little bit of the Vintage Photo Distress ink. Just kind of rub that along the edge here. And I'll just tone that ink, the green, down just a tiny bit. Felt like it was a little bit too bright compared to the rest of the card. So as far as the compartmental techniques that I can share with you, of course you can start off with, you know, cutting your base background paper. So whether you want to do the cardstock, colored cardstock, or create your own colored panels, you can do that. Then you can do the stamping for the background, and then you could do the trimming for the background. Then you could do the stamping of the Santa, then you could do the coloring of the Santa. Again, if you don't want to do the detailed watercoloring like I did in the video, you could just stamp that image in solid red. And even though that would give you a slightly different look, it would still kind of save you some time. The next step then you could do would be to do the die cutting for the flowers and leaves. And again, if you want to save time, cut them from colored cardstock, or you can do like I did where you've got the sprayed panels that you die cut from. And then of course you have your sentiment, so you could do that step. And then the final step, of course, is just adhering those various layers and finishing off the card. One last thing as I'm looking at this card, and I wish I had done it on both of these, is I wish I had added some gold splatters to the background. I like to use distressed Foundry wax to do that, and I've shared it in previous videos, but let me show that to you here real quick. So anytime I do splattering, I do like to work in my splat box, and this is the distressed Foundry wax, and it has a little shaker ball in it that you need to make sure you get moving and shake it up well so that you get everything mixed together nicely. And then you're also going to need a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and a long paintbrush, and I'm just going to add a little dab of it there to my craft mat. I'm going to take just a drop of isopropyl alcohol and then kind of mix that together, and the alcohol just thins it out enough so that you can splatter with it, because otherwise it's a little bit thick and you can't splatter with it very easily. And then you're just going to tap that onto your background, and I'll admit it does not look like much at this point. The real beauty from Foundry wax happens when you heat set it, and you have to heat set it or it does not stay permanent. This will dry here and I'll be able to just wipe it off with my hands. Like it'll just turn into like a dust. And so it will continue to wipe off of any surface that you put it on until it's heat set. Once you heat it though, it is permanent, like completely permanent. It's not coming off of anything. So you've got plenty of time to, you know, kind of clean up, get things out of your way. When you do the heating though, make sure you do not keep the bottle of Foundry wax near the heat source, because it will heat the Foundry wax in the bottle and then you won't be able to use it anymore. And then, you know, if you were to heat what's on your craft mat here, that would become permanent onto the craft mat. So like I said, it wipes up easily with just a paper towel. And then as far as with your brush, I just kind of wipe it off and then just, you know, wash this like I would normally. And then from there, you're just going to take your heat gun like you would use for heat embossing and apply heat to this. And so there you can see now it's nice and shiny and beautiful. So like I said, wish I'd added that little bit of splatter to the background of these, but at this point now I'd have to do quite a bit of masking to try to protect what I've already done. So if you would like to do this, do it before you start adhering everything. So anyway, just a little extra something for you there. Here is a look at the finished card. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this came together and discover the various ways that you can use your stamps and dies to create your Christmas cards. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.